Will they let you people the semester at NC State?
On the same.
Hello, everybody.
How unusual is that? Well, I have tremendous military leaders. I think.
I don't sound like Nola. I'm her husband.
Okay.
But she's here. It's on her laptop. That's why.
Oh, awesome. We're just waiting for everybody to come in.
I
So
know. Usually we're the last ones in, but we're early.
And it's for that reason that all of them spoke out to criticize the attempt by the president to use the military as a
hello.
Hello. Wow, this is great. I have you connected to my TV so I can like look at you really big right there. And that's where the sound is coming from. Wow, that's exciting.
My name, but you can't see me.
Yes.
It's my wife. I'm on my wife's laptop, but she's here also.
Nice. Trying to figure out how to get you just on one screen. Because right now I see everybody on this screen and Julia really big on that screen. So
Interesting.
here, let me practice screen sharing.
Oh,
You need to enable.
Let me enable it.
Only 3 people here right now.
Yes. Okay, it should be enabled now.
Okay, cool. All right, does it look like a PowerPoint?
Yes, it does.
Okay, cool. So I gotta figure out how to squeeze everybody into one screen and see my notes.
Is there a way like we could be on one screen and your PowerPoint could be on a different screen for you?
Yeah, I just also want my notes to be on that same screen, but that is the plan.
Wow, so many different screens.
Yeah, I need another TV.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
Why don't you start a GoFundMe? Maybe you can get money for a new screen.
There we go. Yeah. I mean, I do have a monitor in the other room, which I could grab, but that feels a little too extra. Also, I'm so prepared for technical difficulties this time. I like printed out all of my notes so that even if everything fails and all you can do is just like see my face, then I can still keep going.
Great.
Yeah. Also, I'm hoping that my cat doesn't invite herself into the talk.
Always a good addition to any talk.
Yeah. So there we go. Cool.
Yeah, so we can just wait till 7:30 and people will trickle in.
Sounds good. Cool. While we're doing that, I'm just gonna look over my notes a little bit more.
Cool.
People are showing up on Jewish time.
Yeah, even over Zoom, Jewish Standard Time, it still applies.
So real. I almost feel like people do more of the Jewish Standard Time on Zoom because it's like you can wait until a minute before the meeting starts to think about it. And then you're like, oh, wait, I actually don't know where the URL is. Oh, and there's a password. Oh, I have to look up that. Like I feel like people push it a lot more to the last minute, myself included. I heard it once described as like the meeting tax that Jews pay because of people not being super timely. Like you have to like pay a tax of the first 10 minutes of the meeting that are just lost, like not productive.
Yeah, for sure. We can give people like 1 more minute to see if anyone comes.
Hey, it's not even the time that it starts yet.
Oh, it is on my computer, but my computer might also be off time-wise.
Oh,
It's
yeah, I would say we should
7:29.
maybe wait until like 7:35. I don't know.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Was that you, Jim? I didn't see you join the meeting. Hi.
Hey,
Oh, and my mom's here. Hi, Mom.
My cat just popped up and is sitting at my, sitting close to my lap. So hopefully she won't interrupt us too much if she just sits peacefully on my lap. I made sure to feed her beforehand so that she doesn't think that she can just sort of butt her way into the call. But be prepared to see her walk across back here. She loves to make little cameos.
Hey, Averyl.
And there's my mom. She also has cats walking back and
I was
forth.
going to say, my cat is walking back and forth.
So I might mute myself soon here and
No
turn the
worries.
video off.
I don't know if you heard when you were joining, but I was just saying that my cat is sitting on my lap now, and hopefully she will stay there where she's not disrupting anything.
Okay, well, Lula's dancing back and forth.
That's great.
Yeah.
So Julia, what are the other topics of the talks that you had for the past couple of Mondays?
Oh, so we've been doing them since the beginning of March, or since mid-March. A lot of different cooking. Rhonda Goodman did matzo ball soup cooking. Anya did cheesecake cooking for Shavuot. Then we also had Josh and Sari Rose talk about their trip in Costa Rica. I did one about the Bedouins. Bonnie Leach did one about mahjong strategies.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, we've had so many different things. So
That's great.
yeah,
Cool.
and in 2 weeks, the Progressive Kahila, which is like a kind of part of Beth Meyer, breakaway from Beth Meyer group, is doing a like voting registration night thing.
Cool. To get people to register themselves to vote.
Yeah, and to talk about, what voting will be like this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, honestly, it's kind of hard to think that far ahead. Like, November, I'm trying to get through June.
Yeah, I'm surprised. It doesn't even feel like June. I feel like May was like one day.
Yeah, I honestly still think that it's March, and you can't convince me otherwise.
Yeah, so do we want to get started?
Sure. And I also have a little wiggle room built in to for Jewish Standard Time too. So if people are arriving, they can still sort of know what's going on.
Cool.
So did you want to say anything first, Julia?
I just wanted to welcome everyone to coming to our next speaker night. As I just said, we have next week, Bonnie Leach is doing another mahjong strategy. And the week after that, Progressive Kahila is running a You Can Vote program. Both of those will be the same Zoom link. So thank you guys for coming out. And I'll give the floor to Eve.
Hi. Welcome, everybody. And thanks, Julia, for inviting me to speak tonight, and to everyone else for being here. As you may have read in the announcements, I just finished my third and final year as the Director of Youth Engagement at Bethel in Durham. But before that, I graduated in 2017 from UNC Chapel Hill with a double major in Jewish Studies and Women's and Gender Studies and a minor in Modern Hebrew. And I was honored to be given highest honors for the work I did on my honors thesis, which is what I'm here to talk to you all about tonight. It's a huge passion project of mine, so I'm really excited to get to share this with you all. So can everybody see my PowerPoint? Okay, yeah, great. So okay, there we go. So to start off, I'd like to ask everybody to change your name on Zoom to include your pronouns. So you can see that I changed my name to say Averyl, and then in parentheses, she, her. Your pronouns are just how you like to be referred to in the third person. So oftentimes they're she, her, or he, him, or they, them. But it's helpful for me if I want to refer back to a question that you asked or something that you posted, just so that I know the right way to refer to you. And so then after you're done with that, I'd love if you could post in the chat and say what brought you to this talk. Do you have an interest in the subject? What are you hoping to get from it? What don't you understand about the Genesis creation narratives with respect to gender? What parts frustrate you? I'd love to be able to know sort of the interest of the group, so I can make sure if I have answers to your questions that I definitely address them. And Julia, I may need your help with reading stuff from the chat, because I'm not sure if I'm able to see that on top of like all of the other windows that I have open.
Yeah,
So Yeah, so if you wouldn't mind sort of being my chat liaison and reading questions that people have, or the stuff that they're posting. And then also occasionally I might ask you to call on people to answer questions too. Yeah, and then if you want, this is totally optional, but I encourage you to take out a Humash or open up a website to Genesis chapter 1. I like mechonmamre.org because you have the option to view the parallel English and Hebrew, but that's me. But we'll sort of be talking about a lot of different parts of the a couple of verses, so it might it's helpful for me when I was doing my research for this to look things up and to have that handy while I was doing my research. So,
Jim commented in the chat that I've always identified as the Steve in Adam and Steve, meaning I don't see myself in the story at all.
Great. I mean, not great, but that's a great thing to share. I appreciate it. I'll actually address Adam and Steve specifically, so that's helpful.
And Lynn Schwartz said, "This is a topic I have not thought much about, so it interests me. Thanks for opening my mind."
Cool.
And
Take
your
your
mom
time.
said, "I'm a fan of the speaker."
Classic.
Norma Zendel said, "We are all made in God's image. I would love to learn how to interpret Genesis that way."
Great. All right. Maybe we'll take one more and then I'll get started. Okay, I think I'm just gonna get going.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so I'm going to start off by giving you all a little background on what brought me to this project. It all started with an article that made me really angry. It was published in the Jewish Journal on December 2nd, 2015, written by a man named Dennis Prager and entitled "The Torah and the Transgendered." Prager alleges that non-Orthodox Jews tend to not consult the Torah first when they're trying to figure out what position to take on an issue, and that when the Torah disagrees with their stance, they conclude that the Torah is just wrong. And can I get somebody to volunteer to read this quote from his article? Or I can read it myself. Okay. To cite a contemporary example, the Torah prohibits men from wearing women's clothing and women from wearing male garb. For the Torah, the distinction between men and women is fundamental to creating civilization. When the human being is created, the Torah emphasizes male and female he created them. And that distinction is made manifest in the commandments against men and women wearing clothing of the opposite sex. But for modern Jews, the Torah's male-female distinction is anachronistic at best and bigoted at worst. He then goes on to criticize other forms of trans inclusion, especially safe bathrooms for trans people. I'll also note that this was just months before North Carolina's infamous House Bill 2 was enacted, banning trans people from using the bathroom of their identity. But then he switches over to criticizing race-based affirmative action. I don't really see the connection either. But anyway, this article made me mad. It made me mad because the exclusion of trans people didn't fit with the egalitarian Judaism I had grown to feel so connected to, and which was such an important part of my identity. But it also made me mad because, in a way, he was right. I hadn't consulted the Torah before forming the opinion that trans people are valid and that trans Jews deserve to have an affirming place in the Jewish community. So I decided to beat Dennis Prager at his own game and to delve deeply into rabbinic, scholarly, and theological writings on the line that he references, male and female, he created them, to look for Torah-based evidence that trans people do belong in Judaism. Okay. So the stakes are high. But before I want to get into methodology, I want to centered this discussion on why it is so important to find an inclusive reading of the Genesis creation narratives. So does anybody have any thoughts on why it's important, theologically speaking or socially speaking or otherwise?
Jim, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I can't figure out how to raise my hand electronically, so I just raised my hand like that. I mean, for me, it's important because the creation story, one of them at least, says that God called humanity very good. And I think it's important that every human see themselves in that statement of very good.
Yeah, that's great. So wanting to bring in, to make sure that everybody feels like they were a part of that initial creation of humanity. Yeah, great. So that actually fits into my first point. So I call it the prototypical versus archetypical conundrum of Adam and Eve. The prototypical approach of the first couple views Adam and Eve as a prototype. The first version, not the current version, but not necessarily the best version, just a version of a couple. But the much more common way of looking at the first couple is the archetypical approach, that because they were the first couple and they were a man and a woman, that is the model on which all other couples should be based. So as Jim said, this is illustrated perfectly in the phrase, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Like, you wouldn't say that about another biblical couple, like it's Sarah and Abraham, not Sarah and Miriam, because Adam and Eve represent to many the archetype of the ideal couple made directly by God. Which brings me to the next and perhaps even more important issue at stake, which is the image of God. Between the verses 26 and 27 of chapter 1 of Genesis, the phrase, the image of God, is mentioned 4 times in connection with God's human creation. So the way that we interpret this verse not only tells us who is included in the creation of humanity and what is the natural or acceptable range of human relationships within that creation, but also, by extension, whose identities are reflected in the divine image of God. So I pored over dozens of articles, books, essays, speeches, and for each I asked the same 3 questions. What are the implications of this interpretation for women? What are the implications of this interpretation for queer people and non-heterosexual relationships? And what are the implications of this interpretation for transgender and non-binary people? My research yielded me a multitude of voices from a variety of backgrounds. Historical moments, disciplines, and interpretive methodologies, and I set out to put them in conversation with one another. I envision all of the sources sitting in a circle, looking at an obscured object in the middle of the circle, and each person and source sees the object from a different angle and thus describes it differently. So my aim is to pull together as many voices as I can to get as complete a picture as I can of this ultimately unknowable object. So before we dive into the text, I want us to get on the same page, which is probably page 1, just kidding. So as some of you may already be familiar, when we talk about the Genesis creation narratives, we're actually talking about 2 different stories. There's the story in chapter 1 of Genesis, with the 6 days of God creating light, day and night, separating the waters in the sea, the waters of the sea and the waters of the sky, dry land, plants, animals, and finally a male and female Adam before resting on the 7th day. The second story begins in verse 4 of chapter 2 of Genesis, when in a single day, God creates the heaven and the earth, forms the Adam out of the otherwise lifeless earth, and breathes life into him. And it's from this Adam that the rib was taken to make the woman, or Isha, that would later be named Eve. So For time's sake, I'm going to mainly focus on the first creation narrative tonight, so just from chapter 1, but it's important to know that both exist because for many rabbis and biblical scholars throughout the millennia, the existence of two ostensibly conflicting narratives creates an interpretive crisis. Because if you believe that these words are the word of God and therefore perfect and correct, you need to find a way to make both of these narratives fit and be simultaneously true. So as we talk about different interpretations on the Adam created in chapter 1, know that many scholars may also be trying to make sure their interpretation of chapter 1 Adam can fit into the description and events of the chapter 2 Adam. I also want to define some terms that I'll be using that we use all the time in gender studies. Sex versus gender versus sexuality. So let me pull back up your faces. Okay. So sex is what you're assigned at birth based on your genitalia, and it's almost always male or female. Gender is all of the personality traits, behavior, mannerisms, dress, speech patterns, relationship roles, etc., that we have come to associate with people of one sex or another. So your gender is your internal sense of which, if any, of those collections of characteristics feels the most like you. And sexuality is whom you're attracted to sexually and or romantically, and based on a presumption, usually based on a presumption of the sex and gender of the other. And here's a tough thing to swallow for many people. None of these three things, sex, gender, or sexuality, are binaries. I think that people generally get that sexuality and gender are spectrums, although please speak up if you'd like me to explain that more, I'd be happy to. But the sticking point for a lot of people is that sex isn't a binary. So let me explain. People talk about male and female. That is because humans are a sexually dimorphic species, which means that generally our species fall into two categories of male or female, but not always. Also, the categories of male or female are based off of 5 different characteristics. We tend to think immediately of the physical genitalia, but there's also gonads, which are testes and ovaries, chromosomes, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics, which is the stuff that you develop during puberty. And so all of those things, all of those 5 categories sort of combine to and each of them usually have their own sort of range of what is normal within each category. And all of those combine to create a sex of male or female. But sometimes not all of those categories are always within the typical range. And so according to one paper that was published, I think in 2000, the likelihood of a body deviating from the standard ranges of each of those characteristics, or of one of those characteristics that make up male and female, is 1.728, which is almost 1 in 60 people. Some people call themselves intersex because of that deviation. Some people don't even know that they're technically intersex because it's like a minor deviation. But humans don't fall on a sexual binary either. So, any questions? Well, yeah, any questions on all of that before we continue? Because I know that's a lot to throw at you all at once. Looking good? Okay, great. So, can I get somebody to volunteer to read either the English or the Hebrew of verses 26 and 27 of chapter 1 of Genesis? Okay, I can just read out the English and point out the Hebrew words that stand out to me. So, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God created man in God's own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So the Hebrew words to note here are ha-adam right here, which is a singular, the Adam is, yeah, Adam in the singular, or at least grammatically it looks like it is. B'Tselem Mo is in God's image. B'Tselem Elohim is in the image of God. God made him, again in the singular form. Zachar unekeva bara otam. So male and female, they were created. So this is when it goes from a singular gender to a plural, or a singular pronoun to a plural pronoun. So yeah, so the first thing that many notice is that there is the change in pronouns in reference to the Adam. First him, and then adding the male and female, and Zachar u'Nekava, it becomes them. So which is it? Did God create one being or multiple beings? Well, it depends on whom you ask. So we're first going to hear from the people who interpret the chapter 1 Adam as a single being. So Philo of Alexandria was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt in the first half of the 1st century BCE. So that's about 100 to 50 BCE, before year 0. In one of the first ever known commentaries of the Genesis creation narratives, he writes that the first being was an entirely spiritual being, lacking any kind of sex or gender, and connected exclusively to the image of God. The second Adam, created in chapter 2 out of the earth, is the Adam that is created with sex, gender, and sexuality. So to him, both Adams are present in humans, but he's coming from a world of Greek philosophy in which one's pure spiritual self is valued over the more animalistic self that has a physical sex or sexual urges. His perspective is shared with other early Christian writings which separate holiness from the physical body or sexuality. Philo also lives in a world where man is considered the ideal, the unmarked, and a reflection of the divine, and women as the marked gender have no place within that divine reflection, because to be a woman is to have gender and to be linked inextricably with their role in sexuality and reproduction. Let's compare that with the rabbis of the Talmud a couple hundred years later. So this is from Genesis Rabbah 8:1. So this ends up being a whole long discussion between the rabbis, but this is sort of the main point, that Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgyne or androgynos. As it is said, male and female, he created them. So what does that mean? So the rabbis of the Talmud agree that this first being was created as a physically androgynous being, or that it had both male and female sex characteristics. According to Daniel Boyarin, the rabbis of the rabbinic period differ from the Greeks and Hellenized Jews. So rather than presenting a utopia of the neutral sex that falls into the imperfections of sexual difference, the human race was marked from the very beginning by corporeality, difference, and heterogeneity. Sexuality belonged to the original and not fallen state of humanity. So this interpretation sees sex and probably gender to be a part of that which is essentially human, and therefore also what is reflected in the image of God. The rabbis go on to describe more specifically the possible characteristics of this being and the proportions of it that are male versus female, so that when the female is separated in chapter 2 from the being, is it just a rib that is removed, or is it a side, which could be a whole half of the body? So, unlike Philo, the Talmudic rabbis' interpretations have the potential to put the male and the female sex on equal footing, but it's still heavily rooted in a binary understanding of sex and gender. So, the Zohar takes these interpretations a bit further and a bit weirder, which is very on brand for the Zohar. So according to Elliot Wolfson's essay cited at the bottom of this slide, the first human was a male androgyne, which is to say that it is male that possesses both male and female qualities. The equality and oneness denote a unifying gender without sexual differentiation. This interpretation suggests that there is such thing as gender that is universal and somehow distinct from sex, which I have a hard time accepting within a gender studies lens, which insists that gender is socially constructed differently across societies, cultures, and histories. So it is unclear to me what the authors of the Zohar are imagining when they separate gender from sex, and what those male and female qualities are that are present in that first human that are not at all related to physical sex. So let's move on to the next category of interpretation, Adam as two beings. So the following interpretations view the Adam that is created in chapter 1 as two beings, one male or Zachar and one female or Nekeva. So what does Zachar u Nekeva mean? So Zachar literally means penis or member, though it's also related to the word remember, which there's a whole lot of feminist literature on that as well. So a being that is Zachar presumably is a being with a penis. Nekeva, as translated by Rachel Adler, translated by Rachel Adler as the pierced one, or the one with boundaries that are penetrated. Judith Plasko translates it as the one with an orifice, but in Adler's translation, it is not merely that this being has an orifice, but that the orifice exists for the purpose of being penetrated. Adler describes this relationship between the Zachar and the Nekeva as that of the doer versus the done to. So, to rephrase, Adler views Zachar u Nekeva to mean the creation of two humans distinguished from one another based on physical sex within a binary for the purpose of heterosexual behavior between the two sexes. However, to Adler, the male and female are still valued equally, but the sexual relationship between the two is one of negotiating boundaries. So, for Adler, it's not the two humans themselves or even the relationship between them that is necessarily the archetype that is created in verse 27, but sexuality itself, albeit a heteronormative sexuality. So this is about sexuality, which is both boundaried and boundary transcending, at once personal and transpersonal, private and public. Overriding the physical and emotional boundaries that keep human beings distinct from one another, sexuality urges us to open our portals, to extend ourselves, to create places of cohabitation where we and the other are linked. Carol Myers, who incidentally is a member at Bethel and a renowned archaeologist and Hebrew Bible scholar, she agrees that Zachar u Nekeva signals the creation of a heterosexual relationship, though she sees it as much more about procreation linked to the following verse, commanding the two humans to be fruitful and multiply, much more than about the creation of a sexuality that is distinct from procreation. So she says it is not erotic or about gender roles or power. In fact, the parity of male and female in Genesis 1 probably was not meant for anything beyond the pairing of male and female for procreative purposes. The structure and purpose of Genesis 1 simply does not address the social world of humans. So she argues essentially that the world that is described in chapter 1 is hypothetical. It doesn't exist within the world of people. So it's more sort of addressing the concept of procreation rather than about actual relationships between individuals. So the third interpretation is Adam as humanity, where Adam stands to represent humanity as a whole. So a number of scholars have tried to expand our understanding of what Zachar u Nekeva includes. Rabbi David Seidenberg, in his open response to Dennis Prager's article that I mentioned at the beginning, argues that the archetype created in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, is not the archetypical couple or models for humans, but for a single human. That is, within each person is the capacity for both masculinity and femininity. However, this interpretation seems less concerned with Zachar and Nekava's apparent connection with physical sex. The interpretation by transmasculine Rabbi Ari Lev Fornari echoes Seidenberg's sentiment while accounting for the connotation of physical sex in Zachar u'Nekava. He argues that Zachar u'Nekava is a merism, or a phrase that contains more than the meanings of the individual words. So he cites other uses of merisms in the Torah, such as Yomam V'Layla, which literally mean day and night, but symbolically mean all time, and Shemayim Va'aretz, which literally mean heaven and earth, but mean all spaces or the universe. And another example in English is the phrase flesh and blood. When you're talking about your flesh and blood, you're not talking about a pile of blood and skin. You know, it represents a whole person that is your child or your descendants. So in the same way, he does also make a note that most merisms in the Torah tend to have a hard vav rather than the u. So the Yomam Va'Layla, Shemayim Va'aretz rather than Zachar u'Nekeva. But he argues since the pronunciation of the u is Masoretic and thus comes from more than 1,000 years after the Torah was written, it doesn't necessarily take Zachar u'Nekeva out of the running to be a merism. So what does male through female mean in this context? It is a spectrum that includes people with penises and people who have an orifice and engage in heterosexual behavior, but also anyone in between and beyond. Joy Layden echoes Lev Fornari's position by arguing that Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 creates humans as a sexually dimorphic species. That is, a species that typically produces individuals of one or two sexes, but does not preclude the existence of individuals who are born in between, or individuals who over the course of their lives become somewhere in between. She concludes that the sex connoted words of Zachar u'Nekeva creating a sexual binary is a lot less destructive than that of a gender binary, which traps people in a lot more than just their physical bodies. So what she says is, as far as God is concerned, and God's perspective is the only one the text offers, differences in physical sex have none of the significance that mark the presence of binary gender. The assignment of different roles, characteristics, feelings, desires, earning capacity, and authority based on maleness and femaleness. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what the first human looks like. Let's go now to a discussion of what exactly is being reflected in humans from the image of God. Excuse me. Phyllis Tribble's 1978 book, God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, uses rhetorical criticism to approach the image of God, which uses the text itself as the primary clue to interpretation. So her argument essentially goes, humans are made in the image of God, animals are not. What in chapter 1 is unique to humans and not shared with animals? So both humans and animals are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. So whatever is unique about, or whatever is part of the image of God is not being fruitful and multiplying. But humans alone are commanded to have dominion over all of the earth, and they are called Zachar u'Nekeva. The animals are never referred to as Zachar u'Nekeva. So that would seem to suggest that whatever Zachar u'Nekeva is, it's not the same thing as being fruitful and multiplying, or presumably procreation. So what Tribble does next, I find really interesting. So she breaks verse 27 down into a poem and arranges it like this. And God created humankind in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. She identifies the parallel structure embedded within the repetition of created he him and created he them, which implies that in the image of God and male and female are linked or related. So according to Tribble, male and female, or Zachar u'Nekava, is the key through which to understand what about humanity is made in the image of God. So now we have all of these interpretations of Zachar u'Nekava. How do they hold up in a divine reflection? Let's go back to Adler. Again, for her, Zachar u'Nekava are sexuality. And she goes further to say that the aspects of sexuality that are the reflection of God's divine image are boundaries and power. Boundaries, as evidenced in the boundary piercing translation of Nekeva, and power in the form of piercing or the other uniquely human quality, having dominion over all of the earth. Additionally, in Kabbalah, the sexual or marital union of a man and woman is considered a reflection of the image of God, because it's when Zachar and Nekeva are together that God exists. Or perhaps we can use the spectrum approach in understanding the image of God, that within the divine image is the full range of sexes, sexualities, and genders as they have manifested across time and culture, and that God has features that are feminine, masculine, in between, and beyond. So I'll conclude with the interpretation that I find the most promising for women and LGBTQ plus people in an inclusive sense. So the interpretation would see Adam as a single metaphorical person to represent all people, who is both capable of penetrating and being penetrated, being active and being submissive, and that Zachar u'Nekava is a spectrum to include all humans within a sexually dimorphic species. And actually, since we have time for it, I'll tell you my favorite interpretation that pulls together the 3 chapters that sort of consist of the Genesis creation narratives, which is that chapter 1 is the creation of sex, given all of our discussion of Zachar u'Nekeva. Chapter 2 is the creation of gender, because there's no mention of Zachar u'Nekeva. It's just the Isha, a woman is created from the Adam, and the Adam sees the Isha and says, I'm naming you Isha because you are taken from Ish. So one great interpretation of that I like is from Joy Layden, which says that gender is essentially about seeing someone else and seeing yourself and trying to create and distinguish yourself from another person. That gender is entirely relational in its existence. And so and that gender itself isn't inherently evil, or that we shouldn't try to abolish gender, and it's not inherently hierarchical or oppressive, but it's at its purest, it's the way that we understand how to interact with other people in our world, because it's kind of a cheat sheet of what to expect when I interact with you, and what you expect when you interact with me. And then the interpretation goes on to say that chapter 3 is the creation of hierarchy and sexism, because it's then that that the 2 humans eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and within that knowledge is the capacity to oppress. And so it's only after that that we see God's curses, that that woman will have pain in bearing children and will always be subservient to the man. So so anyway, that's my brief summary of my thesis in general. So thank you everybody for coming. This was just a quick overview of chapter 1, but if you would like more detailed explanations, or to know what else I talk about in chapters 2 and 3, feel free to check out my thesis, which is publicly available on UNC Libraries. You can just search my name or use the keywords cisgender genesis. My name is pretty unique, so you shouldn't have too hard of a time finding it if you're interested. So yeah, now I'd be happy to take any questions from anyone.
Ooh, thank you, Averyl. Yeah, if you have questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and you can share your questions.
Hi.
Or you can, go ahead.
Hi. This is what I really love about Judaism because, you know, especially, I guess, you know, if you're not strictly Orthodox, there's some ability to interpret and to address things as the culture and society changes. And really, when you know the actual explanation of the root Hebrew, it really creates an ability for you to really extend that. And I remember somewhere I had a lecture when, you know, and I guess it was verse 27 in chapter 1, that there was this idea that the male-female entity was androgynous or hermaphroditic or whatever. So it allows for some element of gender fluidity or sexuality or whatever. You just need to know the basic Hebrew. So I love that about Judaism, and so much writing from female, you know, scholars in terms of that interpretation. And I commend you on your research and your thesis. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was something that I really appreciated when I was doing my research is, you know, a lot of it was sort of over certain time periods. And the more women and trans people that were given a platform to be able to write about the Genesis creation narratives, you got way more really interesting and creative ways of looking at it. So it's like the more perspectives you can have, like you can only enrich your understanding of the text. Like if you only ever hear the text from a certain perspective, you're missing so much of the depth that the text holds.
And I think knowing the Hebrew, being able to actually know the actual Hebrew, that's, I think, really important. Like that whole thing that you talked about with Nekeva and, you know, what that really meant. That was really good.
Yeah, thanks.
Great talk. Thank you, Averyl.
Averyl, I was wondering, are there any other texts that are used to talk about transness in Judaism besides this one, or is this like the main one that's used?
Like transness and Judaism in general?
Or like when people try to talk about like transness in the Torah, is this like the main passage?
Well, so the other one was hinted at in Dennis Prager's article, which is the one in Leviticus that says like a man shall not put on women's clothing and a woman shall not put on men's clothing. Yeah, so that's a big one. And I've heard some people say like, because I think I'm trying to remember exactly what the details are about it, but I think in that line, it kind of has like a connotation of that it is for the purpose of deceiving. And so what I found like liberatory about that sort of addition is, well, you know, like a trans person isn't deceiving anyone, they're dressing as themselves. So this sort of, you know, banning people from dressing like differently than their sex assigned at birth doesn't really apply. In fact, they're being more truthful about who they are than like what they would be if they're dressing according to the sex assigned to them. So yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure there are some other ones too, but I know that these two are the biggest ones. Also, there's a whole lot of really interesting stuff in the Mishnah about gender roles and even different genders besides the sort of typical male and female. I'm trying to remember what part of the Mishnah it is. I would have to get back to you on it, but it actually says that there are 6 different genders. And if you think about it, this is the rabbis in about 200 CE. So after the temple has been destroyed, and they're just sort of trying to keep Judaism alive by studying as hard as they can and trying to like add on all of this extra law that's not made clear in the Torah that they have. So they're sort of expanding the body of oral Torah. And what they sort of come to realize is, well, like not everybody in our society evenly sort of fits into these categories of male or female, because, you know, that's like natural in like human communities and stuff. So they were like, well, how do we apply these mitzvot to people whose bodies don't neatly fit into male and female? And so they actually come up with these other 4 categories of different types of bodies and what mitzvot they should do. And some of them are like modified based on female, modified based on male, but some of them are totally unique to those genders. So you know, there's Zachar and Nekava, which we discussed. And then there's Saris, and I'm not going to remember all of them right now. But basically, there's like a castrated male is a different gender. There is a woman who doesn't have secondary sex characteristics, so doesn't like have like breasts or like doesn't really change during puberty. And then there is a gender for a person who, like, when they're born, it's not clear what their genitalia is because like maybe their skin covering it or something. And then there's another gender that's if they have both male and female genitalia. So, and I think what is so interesting and telling about the rabbis of the Mishnah describing each of these different people is that there's no question of are they people or are they Jews? It's, okay, well, we've been given this framework from God that talks about male and female, but not all Jews fit into that. So how do we do our best at trying to like fit the commandments given to us onto these people? And so I don't know, I really like that. And it's still, you know, it's still not ideal because it's still creating different classes, but I think it's very telling that it's like, okay, great, we have these people, they're Jews, how do they follow the commandments too?
Yeah, it's great how like it's like just assumed that for sure they're Jewish, regardless of what their gender is or like, you know, how you're going to categorize them. That's like not part of the conversation.
Yeah, and honestly, the commandments that are or aren't given to them is really mostly pragmatic. It's not at all about like relegating people into different positions. Like, for instance, there's the whole issue of levirate marriage, which is that if a man dies, his brother is supposed to marry his wife. And, you know, that's from a context in which a woman without her husband, it will be destitute because she's not able to provide for herself. So it's kind of a condition to say, like, even if I die, like, I know that my wife will be taken care of. So, and I think there's also especially if she doesn't have children, that the brother needs to sort of take over the responsibility of making sure that there are children that are blood related to the husband who died. So, you know, so oftentimes some of the like non-binary genders are exempted from levirate marriage, but that's it. And that's just because they're not likely to be able to reproduce. And that's really the only difference. And also it's interesting because, you know, a lot of there's only 2 positive commandments on women, specifically. That's, I think, to light Shabbos candles and bake challah, maybe. But there's way more positive commandments, like do versus like don't do.
I think it's like Shabbos candles and go to the mikveh.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, thank you. So, but for men, there's way more positive commandments. And so for a lot of these people that are sort of in between gender-wise, the rabbis say, well, like, let's default to having you do all the male stuff just in case God's rules for men apply to you. And we don't want to like have you not do them and then like have God apparently like in God's mind consider you to be male. So it's sort of defaulting when possible to doing more mitzvahs than not. So yeah.
Cool.
Any other
Well,
questions?
thank you, Averyl. If you have any more questions, anybody, you can email me or you can email Averyl if you want to put your email in the chat, Averyl. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, Averyl.
Yeah, thanks. Here, I'll just leave my screen up. Bye,
Okay.
Rochelle.
Good night, everyone.